Hello and welcome to the SHRMLabs WorkplaceTech Spotlight. My name is Trevor Schochner, Workplace Innovation Specialist here at SHRMLabs, SHRM's Workplace Innovation Lab. I'll be your host today, filling in for Guillermo on this episode of the WorkplaceTech Spotlight, a series where we shine a spotlight on some of the most interesting future of work innovators, innovations, and issues of today. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping and some general announcements. We wanted to announce the Workplace Tech Community, a brand new platform from SHRMLabs and SHRM. It's a community that we're calling the TripAdvisor for HR technology. We hope you will take a look at workplacetechcommunity.shrm.org. Also, we have two events coming up next week, our Better Workplaces Challenge Cup semifinals for the US and Canada, and for our global round on Tuesday and Thursday. And we hope you'll join us for those as well. For those of you watching on LinkedIn or other social media platforms, please share this live stream and tag SHRM. And you can use the hashtags SHRMLabs and WorkplaceTech. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about employee retention. Employee retention continues to be a critical concern for HR professionals. High turnover rates can result in substantial costs, with estimates ranging from 30 to 50% of a person's annual compensation to replace them. Feedback is an essential tool in the retention toolbox. By aggregating feedback and displaying it to managers and HR professionals in a real-time analytics dashboard, employers can identify and address issues before they become costly problems. But do traditional feedback mechanisms work for employees? Does a point-in-time solution really give us the full picture? I'm very excited. Joining us to talk about this topic is Ansel Duff, founder of 40. Ansel, thanks so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for having me. Good morning, everybody. My name's Ansel. I studied engineering at Harvard, and then I spent some years working in finance, in investment banking, and then in private equity. And in those jobs, I observed a number of pretty serious issues happen at work. And some of these issues led me to consider these types of challenges from an HR perspective. So each time I saw some of these interpersonal issues and conflicts occur, the companies that I worked for didn't really have the feedback loops in place to learn about the problem, but then also recognize that they needed to fix it. And so, motivated by my own frustrations and experiences, I dreamt up a solution that would let a professional initiate feedback in the moment and without needing to wait for their company or their manager to check in a structured way. And this gives the professional empowerment to share feedback at the exact moment that they need to, and it gives those managers insights in real time. Feedback's kind of like a marketplace in that you need to equip each side with tools to communicate with the other side, and it helps drive a more mature and professional organization. So I feel so strongly about this problem that I quit my job in finance to pursue solving it full time. The result is 40, and it's recently launched. The purpose is to strengthen the employee experience and drive engagement, productivity, and ultimately retention by extracting actionable feedback from employees in real time. I'm excited to talk to you all today about retention and about feedback.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ansel. And wondering if you can set the stage a little bit for us around this topic of employee retention. Obviously, it's a huge topic. Everybody's heard the words, but based on your research and kind of how you've been looking at it from the lens of 40, I'd love to learn a little bit more. And if you could set the stage for us just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So for starters, we're in some stage of the Great Resignation. I know we've all heard that term flying around. Highest quit rates in the past 20 years, likely brought about by COVID, but there isn't even really consensus on that point. For example, the Harvard Business Review argues that the kind of driving factors of the Great Resignation predate the pandemic. This situation is honestly compounded by the reality that baby boomers are resigning and there's a shortage of skilled laborers to fill their roles. So this makes the employment landscape increasingly complex for an organization and specifically for HR. When solutions providers talk about retention, there's usually a few themes that are associated with it, and rightfully so. We often talk about recognition, things like awards, peer recognition, social currency, swag. There's engagement platforms. These are management surveys, gathering the pulse on an organization. And then there's even longer term career development and progression, things like promotions, learning, development, that sort of thing. Now, obviously, it's in everyone's best interest to avoid turnover, right? As you mentioned, it's in the neighborhood of 30 to 50% plus the cost of an employee's annual compensation to replace them. That's a huge amount and it adds up very quickly. One area that I'm excited to focus on today in the retention toolbox is organic or unstructured feedback. And when I say organic or unstructured, I'm really talking about feedback that is sought outside of a formal process. Now, only 21% of employees feel comfortable being honest about what they want at work. Less than 1 in 4 highly engaged employees report having a good experience at work or a positive experience. And the top reasons for 2021 quitting were in order: pay, lack of advancement opportunities, and feeling disrespected in the workplace. So, intuitively, but also supported by the data, managers and HR professionals can have a huge impact on turnover with interpersonal changes alone that don't require changes to employee compensation, the company as a whole, the nature of the job, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thanks so much for that background, and really want to dig in a little bit. We're talking about the managers and HR professionals having that huge impact. Can you give us a little more insight on what you mean by that and how that's affecting employees?
Yeah, so as I referenced a moment ago, the biggest reasons that employees are quitting lately in the past couple of years, in descending order, are A, the pay is too low, compensation related issues. There's not really opportunities for advancement in their track. They felt disrespected at work, childcare issues, and lack of workplace flexibility regarding how they spend their time working. So, our topic of retention is really pretty intimately related to employee satisfaction, and not only in their role, but also in the daily work life experience. So, obviously, dissatisfied employees are going to be the ones that are quicker to leave the organization. According to SHRM's own research, how employees perceive job satisfaction can be distilled into a handful of factors. There's respectful treatment of employees at all levels, compensation, trust between employees and senior management, job security, and opportunities for employees to use their skills at work. So, managers and HR can influence about half of the job satisfaction topics by just getting the interpersonal stuff right, even before you touch compensation, job security, advancement opportunities, company direction. So, while it's important to consider all of these satisfaction topics when thinking about retention, we can at least have a pretty tangible impact on satisfaction by focusing on managers and the relationships with their teams. So, for example, throwing cash at the problem isn't always a reliable way to fix it, as evidenced by somewhat lackluster corporate results from retention bonuses. There was a Harvard Business Review article a couple months back where a senior HR professional at a publicly traded biotech company gave out retention bonuses, and then 90% of those employees ended up leaving anyways. So, as we think about feedback as part of the retention equation, SHRM notes that 59% of employees would have stayed in a prior job if they had a different boss. Yet the majority, 55% of these employees, also never reported their boss's bad behavior to leadership. So, despite all of the great HR technology platforms out there, and there really are some great tools, and we'll get into that a little bit later, there's still clearly a feedback hole that's contributing to turnover. Some of these insights are getting lost along the way. So, this is why I want to highlight incorporating organic feedback into a retention strategy. While engagement tools are great and a really important part of a modern HR stack, employer led surveys can leave some critical interpersonal insights still falling through the cracks. Employees often feel concerned about being honest in these forums for fear of retaliation. Organic feedback is having an employee supply these insights in a more informal way and when they happen in the moment. So, in addition to kind of periodic engagement surveys, capturing feedback organically when it happens, it makes everybody's lives easier because it helps prevent the problem from growing up until the next structured check-in or performance review. As I'd mentioned earlier, both employees and the company obviously are aligned to reduce retention. It's in everyone's collective best interest for employees to remain happy, engaged, and to perform well. Now, responding to organic feedback can also help in a more individual level and drive the feeling of responsiveness from management. For example, if a manager responds to my individual organic feedback shortly after I provide it, I can be assured that at a minimum, it was received. Whereas if I supply my feedback in a pulse survey alongside dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of other employees, my feedback may get lost in the mix, even if the organization is receiving it in earnest. And so the knock-on effect of handling feedback organically is that employees feel listened to and they're more engaged and perform better.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And that's such an interesting point about the organic feedback versus, traditional feedback mechanisms. I know, I'm sure we both know as employees at organizations, we consistently get the pulse survey, we get the annual survey, we get the quarterly check-in.
Right.
But yeah, that's such an interesting point. And if you want to speak to anything like, how do you think this is going to impact employees on the employee side? Do you think it's going to be well received? Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, at first it may feel a little unfamiliar, the idea of kind of contributing an insight when it happens, because it probably is a little bit different than the types of more structured or periodic touch points that you're describing. The engagement or the pulse survey that you get once a year, twice a year, a once or twice a year performance review. That's kind of a more formal sit down. The flip side to that is, though, the idea of empowering them in a safe way that gives them enough flexibility and controls to be able to share these insights without fear of retaliation, but also making the collection process safe and useful enough that the data that's actually being provided is going to help. It's not just a forum for maybe airing grievances without a line of sight to a solution. So it may feel a little unfamiliar given how we kind of structure the periodic or company-led touch points now, but it is extremely powerful. And so long as there are safety and controls around it, it can be really useful for an organization.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting point. I mean, as we see more and more of our lives becoming personalized, I think there's almost like personalized feedback, right? We're able to really take control over the feedback we want to give it when we want to give it as employees. I think that's really, really powerful. But, for our audience out there, what are, some helpful tools or some possible solutions for people when it comes to improving their retention and maybe implementing some of these feedback mechanisms?
Yeah, for sure. So I want to be upfront that I'm not an HR practitioner, and I appreciate that the folks on this call have a great amount of experience being HR professionals themselves. That said, I have experienced some of these retention pain points in a couple of different jobs, and I felt so strongly that I founded an HR tech solution to create a safe space for feedback inside of companies. And so because of that, I tend to approach retention kind of tactically from a tools perspective. Just to give a little backdrop on industry best practices, leaders like Josh Bersin and Dave Ulrich frame the modern HR functions through a couple different lenses. As people are well familiar, the Ulrich HR model emphasizes strategic focus and organizational collaboration. Employee retention isn't, a silo topic that kind of uniquely falls into just managers or just HR's court. As I'd mentioned a moment ago, there's a lot of HR related and commercial factors that drive employee satisfaction. And so a modern retention program is necessarily cross-function. Somewhat relatedly, Bersin's research also highlights a ton of key trends in HR technology, including the emphasis on the employee experience, EX. This is a big topic lately. And the movement away from kind of the old school core ERP style HCM platforms towards this sort of EX core is what he calls it. And this transition really means that companies are adding a lot of capabilities at the top of the stack. And so I'll kind of gear some of the examples that I give in a moment around that idea that you can have a core solution, but you can add a lot of capabilities that are complementary at the top of the stack. So as it relates to software tools that enable managers in HR, there's been a movement towards this employee experience, as I mentioned a moment ago. And what this really means for HR professionals and managers is that they can add focus tools onto their HR stack to quickly expand their capabilities. And it doesn't really require you to re-architect your core procedures. And so this is really the future of the HR architecture, but it's great for both speed and for costs. You can add these tools very quickly and they're priced accordingly. They're fairly inexpensive, especially when you compare them to the old school kind of ERP style cores that get very expensive to implement. So now onto some specifics. I like to use the toolbox analogy for retention and the employee experience. The best retention program that you can leverage as a company is a group of complementary tools as opposed to a singular approach. In some situations, you might only need one tool, but you're definitely better off having multiple complementary tools. So as a reminder, the core elements of retention tools include recognition, engagement, organic feedback. And as we all know, there's dozens of really powerful and capable solutions on the market that provide software tools that are related to these topics. So for starters, pretty much all of the big HR technology solutions out there have some flavor of these capabilities. And I'm thinking about tools like SAP, Workday, Oracle, Lattice, Bamboo, some of the kind of household name players that have been around for a while and that you guys are all familiar with. But I also wanted to mention some other ones that are worth considering that are a little bit more focused and fall into that top of the stack category. I'll start with engagement and the employee experience. These usually look like some form of company-initiated surveys with an analytics layer on top. I'm being a little bit reductive, but that's sort of what they're doing. And some tools that come to mind that do a really great job are Glint, Culture Amp, Perceptix, WorkTango, Motivosity. Those are some that come to mind. There's dozens of tools out there, so I'm kind of just hitting some of the ones that have stood out to me. Next, moving into recognition, intra-company peer recognition. These are rewards, and they can take a bunch of different flavors. There's social currency, there's monetary gifts, physical gifts like swag, company experiences. Some examples that come to mind are Gusto and Awardco. They're great platforms for gifts and for recognition. Confetti offers unique team building experiences. I came across this cool platform called Go Game that offers shared company experiences like a virtual game show. It's pretty fun. Swag Up to give some great merch to your employees, and even like LinkedIn kudos. Giving kudos on LinkedIn, which is a feature they came out with a few years ago. But building a culture of continuous feedback and recognition is obviously easier said than done. And a lot of the onus really falls on managers to continually motivate their teams and to recognize good work product. So thankfully, though, there are some modern software tools that allow for more of an always listening type of experience for employees. And this is kind of where my company fits in as well. So for organic feedback, some of these EX platforms have feedback capabilities for an employee to initiate feedback on their own, and with enough flexibility and data controls for the information to both be safe and useful. This is the segment that 4D falls into, and I also want to highlight some other options in the space. I'll start with Culture Monkey, which is an engagement platform that does allow for some anonymous messaging between managers and HR and the employee. Work Tango and Impulse give anonymity options that stem from engagement surveys. So as a follow-up from an engagement survey, you can initiate an anonymous dialogue with an employee. And then I also want to mention my own company, 4D, which is a retention tool that creates a safe space for real-time organic feedback within the organization. Lastly, on the feedback point, in addition to some of these sort of intra-company EX platforms, there is also some social platforms as well, where employees can and do speak openly about work issues, even if the insights aren't ultimately delivered to their employer or to their manager. So there's the obvious ones, right? Like LinkedIn, Glassdoor, Facebook, and Twitter. But managers and HR professionals should also keep a pulse on some of the younger platforms that have kind of been gaining in popularity. And specifically, I'm thinking about Blind, Discord, and Fishbowl. And these platforms tend to attract a bit of a younger and more tech savvy demographic. So to the extent that companies have an employee base with some overlap there, these platforms are even more relevant. So I hope that those are some great resources for HR professionals to think about retention through some of the different lenses like recognition, engagement, and organic feedback.
Absolutely, and what a great structure framework to think about as you're thinking about these feedback mechanisms. I think that's all the time we have. I'd love to get maybe if you have a 1 minute prediction. We asked this to pretty much everybody on the show, but one big trend that we'll see in 2023. Obviously, AI is up there, but just curious on the technology front, what your 1 minute take on what we're going to see coming this year.
Yeah, AI is where I would go with that. We've all seen the headlines, right? Over the past few months, there's been a lot of press on this topic, and rightfully so. We're kind of at, or maybe even beyond, this tipping point where the technology is so powerful and it's emerging. It's very recent, right? The power of these language models that we as a society don't really understand the ramifications of these technologies. A good example of this are some of the generative technologies. I'm sure we've all heard Chat GPT, right? Bard, Dolly, some of these tools are making headlines, making waves, and rightfully so. They're extremely powerful. So I strongly believe that we will continue to see AI influence existing and new technology solutions. And the way that it does that is by increasing their scope of capabilities. So one of the biggest strengths, honestly, of the latest AI developments is the power of language processing, the likes of which we just didn't have access to before. So for textually rich data like employee feedback, for example, AI can read and analyze this information simply hundreds, maybe thousands of times faster than we as humans can. And the accuracy and performance of these platforms is improving every single day. So to summarize it all, sort of what's the best use case for AI in HR right now? I strongly believe that AI, simply cannot fix complex interpersonal dynamics like humans can. Obviously, HR practitioners are experienced and exercise their own expertise in dealing with some of these complex management systems and dynamics. And now AI just simply can't replace judgment, which is obviously critical for leaders and HR professionals in employee-facing situations. So with this, the best utilization of AI for managers and human resources is to, I think, have AI handle some of the more mundane blocking and tackling, but also still giving the autonomy and giving the discretion to managers and HR professionals where they can exercise their expertise in these situations. So it's basically kind of a hybrid approach. And that's what we do at 40. That's how we utilize AI at 40. So essentially, we can use the huge analytical power without threatening our complex interpersonal dynamics. I'm skeptical of anyone that suggests that HR professionals' jobs are going to be automated by generative AI in the near future.
Yeah, totally great point. And to your point, it's important for HR professionals to stay up to date on the technologies coming out, knowing what your employees are using. Like you mentioned, all those platforms like Discord and Fishbowl, things that definitely the younger generations are using. It's very, very important to stay up to
Absolutely.
date on all of those things. But
Absolutely.
Ansel, thank you so much for being here and sharing all of your great knowledge. I feel like every time we talk, I learn a little bit more. So I hope everybody out there also felt like you got something great out of this. It's been a wonderful
Thank you so much for having
conversation.
me.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you for
absolutely.
having me.
Absolutely. If you'd like to learn more about 40 and how they're innovating in the workplace, you can visit 40.io/Y Enterprise, and we'll also put that in the chat. If you enjoyed this live stream, please share it using the hashtags SHRMLabs WorkplaceTech and SHRM. And please visit us at SHRMLabs.com to stay up to date on all of our events. Thanks so much again for joining, and we will see you next time.